delivered by Professor Craig Brandist, Professor, University of Sheffield, UK. This lecture will be chaired by Dr. Dipak Gyawali. Dipak Gyawali is a hydroelectric power engineer, political economist, and academician of the Nepal Academy of Science and Technology, as well as chair of Nepal Water Conservation Foundation. A former minister of water resource in Nepal, he is also on the advisory committee of UNESCO's World Water Assessment Program, IDEA Sussex STEPS Center. And in Nepal, he was the founding chairman of a grassroots voluntary NGO dedicated to the task of poverty alleviation. Dr. Gyawali, can I please request you to take over the proceedings?
Thank you. It's a difficult shoes to fill, Satish Jain's, and I've been asked to. And I think my only qualification for chairing this particular session is having studied 11 semesters of Marxism in the former Soviet Union while I was doing my engineering, although I am not a Marxist or let alone a communist. Okay? And one of my memories of Marxist lecture, I think it was dialectical materialism, was taught by a professor called Dmitry Fyodorovich. Now, he had been jailed by Stalin for about 8 years and then was released after self-confession, just before Khrushchev came to power or something like that. And this man, when he gave his lectures on dialectical materialism, came across as a fanatical pro-Stalinist, even though Stalin had jailed him for 8 years. And it was quite amazing, his lectures, where he always began by saying that this is what the great Soviet Union is doing, but out in the West, there is a rising stench of decay. And all my Bulgarian and Czech friends in the class there used to say, oh, for a chance to smell that stench. So this is where I come from, and I'm quite happy to today be able to introduce Professor Craig Brandist, Professor of Cultural Theory and Intellectual History, and Director of the Bakhtin Center at the University of Sheffield. He's published extensively on the works of Bakhtin Circle, Antonio Gramsci's relation to the Russian Marxist thought, development of sociological linguistics in the USSR, and working on Stalinism and neoliberalism. He's currently working with Peter Thomas on a collection of archival documents and commentary on Gramsci's time in the USSR. So without much ado, Professor.
Right, thank you very much. Probably hard to believe, but cultural historians once shone an important and revealing light on hitherto neglected aspects of repression and domination by employing the ideas of Michel Foucault. But since such approaches came to dominate post-colonial studies in the 1980s, those ideas have received the status of what philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn called normal science in the humanities. Yielding few theoretical or phenomenal novelties, the field now mainly involves treating this or that cultural phenomenon as a problem to be solved, with the application of received and assumed categories that supposedly date back to the innovations of Foucault and Edward Said. The limitations of Foucauldian approaches have consequently become ever clearer. The enclosure of post-colonialism within the paradigm of power knowledge, involving the denial of any historical truth that's irreducible to the present-day interests of the historian or those that he or she serves, has seriously compromised its veracity. Moreover, the inflated and under-theorized sphere of discourse that Foucault employed throughout his work has proven deeply problematic. As Christopher Norris argues, the conflation of the linguistic employment of the term discourse to mean any body of language larger than a sentence, with the hugely extended range of meaning that discourse acquires in Foucault, things like body of knowledge, Weltanschauung, ideology, professional code, cultural way of life, habit of thought, scientific belief system, dominant structure of assumptions, and so on, often obscures a lot more than it reveals. French structuralism, with its focus on binary oppositions, and Althusser's conflation of such structures with inescapable forms of ideology, here meet Nietzsche's will to power, which is allegedly everywhere and inescapable. The closed cycle of a putative Orientalist discourse that dates back to the Enlightenment and beyond, structured around a series of binary oppositions, the rational, democratic, progressive West versus the mystical, religious, despotic, stagnant East, is a clear example of where the notion leads. History becomes a relentless monologue, with all individual utterances among those operating within the Western episteme ultimately succumbing to these institutionalized discursive forms. Many important factors have been obscured by this monologic caricature, one of which is the highly contested dialogues between the radical atheistic currents within the Enlightenment, beginning with Spinoza's philosophy, and those moderate philosophers determined to reconcile the advance of science with religious prejudices and the established social order, about which Jonathan Israel, among others, have written in detail. Another is the fact that the narratives developed by Indo-European philology that form the basis of what Edward Said called Orientalism, that endowed Orientalism with its most important technical characteristics, as Said puts it, was nothing like the unified discourse of European Enlightenment thought that it's often presented as. Rather, it emerged from collaboration between European philologists and Brahmin pandits bidding for cultural authority. The post-structuralist theory of language relegated these considerations, the complex historical processes refracted through discursive interaction, as at best of secondary importance. Now, a typical target of attack in post-colonial theory was Hegel. Hegel's disparaging and undoubtedly prejudiced comments on Indian thought. The idea of a unified discourse of Orientalism is superficially convincing here, but the matter's not so simple. As recent study has shown, Hegel's most famous interventions were routinely directed against his own German contemporaries, the German Romantics, who he held over-enthusiastically to exaggerate the wisdom found in the Gita. Often posturing against his rivals, Hegel rides roughshod over subtle distinctions which during more cool and contemplative moments he himself took great pains to tease out. Hegel, it should be said, wrote some 80,000 words on the topic, and while redolent with caricature, often his writings on the historical basis and absurdities of the Indian caste system in many respects are not too far from Indian critics of the same ideas, from Buddha all the way through to Periyar, Phule and Ambedkar. But whatever Hegel's Orientalist failings, they pale before those of Nietzsche and Heidegger, the European philosophers central to the post-structuralist critics of Eurocentrism. Both proponents of the Greek romance of philosophy, promoting the image of classical Greece as pure origin of modern Europe and writing out the whole history of Pharaonic and Hellenistic Egypt and its influence on Greek culture, let alone the Islamic world and medieval Christendom. Nietzsche did, of course, have some respect for Indian thought when it came to pursuing a new order of rank between classes. The laws of Manu became his model for the new aristocracy or a ruling caste in Europe, but this is often passed over in silence. But all this prepared the ground for the post-colonialists seeking to discredit Marxism, the existing paradigm that contested mainstream academic theories as one post-structuralist critic calls it, an extreme form of European Enlightenment thinking. In order to forge a historical myth of post-colonial theory's radical origin. For all its emphasis on emancipation, writes Robert Young in his widely received 1990 book, White Mythologies, Marxism is implicated in the link between structures of knowledge and the forms of oppression. Now, while Young managed to land some justified blows on Althusser, his approach was marked by significant overgeneralizations. While one can certainly find instances of Eurocentrism in the work of some Marxists, Post-colonial critics have often failed to acknowledge that many Marxist works not only developed a critique of the imbrication of Western scholarship about the Orient with imperialism, but also criticised specific Marxist works that were marred by the same assumptions. As Brian Turner put it in his book, Marx and the End of Orientalism, published the same year as Said's Orientalism in 1978, there's no such thing as a unified, homogeneous tradition of Marxist analysis. Now, when looking at the perspectives on the development of Oriental studies in the USSR, the same monologic approach is still very much in evidence. Historian of Soviet Islam, Michael Kemper, for instance, argues the classical Marxist conception of all societies is the concept of five universal socioeconomic stages: primitive society, slave-owning society, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism, what in Stalin's time came to be referred to as the Pyatichlyenka, the five-linked chain. Marxism allegedly sought to locate all societies on this pre-established scheme of stadial development, and this was the basis of a unitary, and I quote again, discourse of Soviet Orientalism that from the outset of the Russian Revolution functioned to turn the Orient into an instrument of Soviet Russia. Marxist writing about the East, he argues, developed a discourse that was itself pure Orientalism in the sense of Edward Said. They unquestionably put their knowledge at the disposal of the state, which used it for ruling and thoroughly transforming contemporary Muslim societies. Now, there's some truth in this statement, combined with a series of conflations and overgeneralizations. In the 1930s, there really was an attempt to homogenize Soviet perspectives on the East and to use that knowledge as a resource for imperial domination of the Soviet East and the subordination of the independence movements of the colonial world to the foreign policy of Moscow. But to simply read a putative Orientalist discourse back into the debates of the 1920s is highly problematic. Furthermore, political practice in the 1920s was quite different to that which prevailed from the end of the decade. There's a fundamental difference between attempting to win leadership in a revolutionary struggle against a common adversary and treating an ally simply as an instrument. The many debates about the nature of Soviet hegemony before and after about proletarian hegemony before and after the revolution focused specifically on that distinction, and it's no coincidence that they came to an abrupt end when Stalin was to declare that socialism had been achieved in the USSR. But the important changes in Marx's own ideas during his long career, an increasingly critical approach to the conceptualizations and generalizations of the positivist historians on which he relied for much of his information, have been the focus of a number of scholars more recently. Irfan Habib, Kevin Anderson, and Gilbert Ashkar, among others. His mature engagements with non-Western societies were exploratory attempts to discern the so-called laws of motion of specific historical transformations and historical formations, rather than locate societies on a pre-established timeline. Trotsky's historical writings on the peculiarities of Russian historical development, which he outlined the principle of combined and uneven development, marked a further step in that direction. It's probably superfluous to rehearse the well-known debates here, but I'm going to focus on a few less well-known factors. In any case, Marx never attempted to construct a unified discourse of Marxism, and indeed repeatedly rejected attempts by those who sought to create one. Indeed, many of Marx's most influential texts were left incomplete and unpublished on his death to be finalized by his editors. Marx never, for instance, wrote a work called The German Ideology. That was pieced together only in the 1930s. His incomplete and fragmentary text only began to publish without editorial interventions in the still complete second Marx-Engels complete works, the Mega, that began to appear in 1975. And as Michael Heinrich, who's writing the first intellectual biography of Marx since these texts appeared, even Marx's most influential texts that were published were only parts of a fundamental theoretical projects that remained unfinished, such as the first book of the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy and the first volume of Capital. Such projects remained unfinished because Marx was a thinker who was constantly learning and developing his theoretical conceptions, and he increasingly studied non-Western societies, which complicated and ultimately compromised his plans. So where did this idea of a unified Marxist discourse on the Orient come from? It has some roots in the somewhat mechanical evolutionism of Second International Marxism, such as Plekhanov's insistence against the Russian populists that Russia would have to pass through a stage of capitalist production before socialism could even be put on the agenda. It was further affirmed in the work of the so-called legal Marxist, Piotr Struve, for whom capitalism could be held to have arrived only when a bourgeois democracy had been established. Increasingly, a variant on this idea has appeared in certain trains of subaltern studies. Not only did all this contradict Marx's late engagements with the Russian revolutionaries, which remained unpublished until the late 1930s, it was directly and decisively rejected by Lenin, Trotsky, and others who led the October Revolution. Plekhanov's approach owed more to the evolutionary narratives of contemporary positivism, which dominated Russian thought in the late imperial period and beyond. Prominent specialists in Oriental studies in the late imperial Russia, such as the great historian of Central Asia Vasily Bartold, were important here. While attracted by Auguste Comte's attempts to establish universal laws of social development, Bartold criticized sociology for being grounded one-sidedly on facts gathered by historians related from European societies. These were inadequate for universal sociology because they constitute but a small minority of the societies which enter into, as he puts it, world historical intercourse. In the absence of a wider evidence base, arose a speculative philosophy of history that gave rise to the unscientific notion of progress and a series of stereotypes, he argues. While progress became an established characteristic of the West, stagnation became a perceived characteristic of the East among educated Europeans. While most European writers about European societies, Eastern societies, viewed the developments as a self-contained process defined by racial origin, recent German historians, such as the Assyriologist Hugo Winkler, had shown that the history of the ancient East is just as much that of Europe as that of Europe, determined by the influence of one nation on another and the distribution of the culture of one or several advanced nations over a wider geographical region. On this basis, such research, Bartold pursued what he considered a more scientific law of evolution, the gradual and consequential change in all the conditions of life of human societies. Bartold had no doubt in how that development would happen, the gradual convergence of an ever greater number of separate societies. It's the narrative of globalization. While sharply critical of British and French Oriental studies for their ideological biases, manifested in binary oppositions that were later defined as Orientalist, Bartold's work promoted Russia's own Eurasian and territorially coterminous imperial project. He argued that scholars must highlight and celebrate the cultural achievements of the peoples of the East, and in doing so contribute towards their peaceful convergence with Russia. The peoples of the East will believe their superiority of our culture all the more when they are convinced that we know them better than they know themselves. Oriental scholarship could thus promote a hybrid identity among the various peoples of Russia, encouraging them simultaneously to take pride in their local cultures and imperial civic space that they shared. Such an approach was characterized in the work of other important scholars, such as the Indologist Sergei Oldenburg, the archaeologist and philologist of the Caucasus Nikolai Marr, who along with Bartold would play an important role in the formation of Soviet Oriental studies and the practical work of building the USSR. While the imperial authorities had no time for a multicultural nationality policy, this was precisely the project that was pursued from the 12th Party Congress in 1923. In the 1920s, though, the positivist approaches of the pre-revolutionary period were but one strand of nascent Soviet Oriental studies. Young Soviet Marxists were coming into the field, seeking to overthrow existing paradigms and guide political intervention in the colonial world, but hampered by a paucity of expertise in Oriental languages and cultures. As in many areas, they relied on the older generation of specialists for factual information, while attempting a critique of their principles of generalization and conceptualization. At the same time, a generation of radical intellectuals from the colonial world, seeking support from the revolutionary regime, found themselves in dialogue with Bolshevik leaders of the Communist International and participating in the newly formed educational institutions of the University of the Toilers of the East in Moscow. We heard about M.N. Roy as one of these people yesterday. From this interaction, a vigorous debate about how to bring Marxism to bear on non-Western societies ensued, with a wide range of approaches coming into view. With the formation of the All-Russian Scientific Association of Oriental Studies, which came under the acronym of VNAV, was formed within the Commissariat of Nationalities in 1921, the definition of the East shifted to mean all areas of the world adversely affected by imperialism. As the director of the eastern section of the Comintern, Georgy Safarov, noted in his 1922 book, Problemy Vostoka, Problems of the East, Marxists needed to respond to what he called the question of the East that was posed by the realities of imperialism and the state of the class struggle. In present conditions, this meant the ways and means through which the backward countries of the East could be incorporated into the global capitalist economic system. And the question was elevated to a matter of principle, he said. The task was to help the labouring masses of the East shorten their path from pre-capitalist means of production to communism and so avoid the suffering inflicted by capitalist development. The goal was to achieve something approaching a smychka, an alliance or union between the proletariat of industrialized countries and the labouring masses of the colonial world against the common enemy, international capitalism. Now, VNAV published a significant journal, Novy Vostok, throughout the 1920s and gave rise to some significant and varied scholarships, such as Gurko Kryazhin's work on Turkey, Sultanzadeh's work on Persia, Safarov's work on Turkestan, and later on China. A range of works developed new perspectives on the origin and development of Islam, aimed at transforming policy both within the USSR and relations with the colonial world. The problem was that these works, understandably, of course, prioritized the enlightenment of the popular masses about the East in order to combat religious and other prejudices, above the elaboration of an alternative to the established and refined ideologies of the pre-revolutionary intelligentsia. As Gramsci noted in his prison reflections on the NEP-era USSR, while in prison he wrote this, Marxists formed an intellectual alliance with the extraneous tendencies, such as philosophical materialism and positivism. Marxism thus combined into a form of culture which was a little higher than the popular average, which was very low, but was absolutely inadequate to combat the ideologies of the educated classes. At the same time, however, students of established Orientalists from pre-revolutionary era assimilated aspects of Marxism and gave their work a new character. Nikolai Konrad's studies of Japanese history, language and literature was one clear example of a certain Marxist perestroika that took place among what Gramsci called traditional intellectuals, while a new generation of linguists involved in the codification and standardizations of the languages of the people of the Soviet East made crucial contributions not only to the study of individual languages, but also to the development of sociological linguistics. The promotion of the languages and cultures of the peoples of the former colonies of the Russian Empire also facilitated the rise to prominence of a number of scholars from the former colonies themselves, such as the Buryat scholar Tsibin Jamsarina and the Armenian historian Josef Obeli. Early Soviet Indology was an innovative field that opposed the dominant Veda-centric approach promoted by European philology and Brahminical interests, and traced the sources of living Buddhist ideas from Siberia through Mongolia and Tibet to the Indian subcontinent. Inspired by such work, Indian intellectuals such as Rahul Sankrityayan and Dharmadand Kasambi, the father of D.D. Kasambi, the historian, were among those who travelled to Leningrad to work with Soviet Buddhologists centred around Fyodor Shubatskoy, who had developed an approach to Buddhism as a systematic philosophy, rivaling European philosophy in its sophistication, rather than a mystical doctrine that needed to be illuminated through the application of Western paradigms. And I think this links on quite well to Shannon Brinkat's interesting talk yesterday. In 1928, an Institute of Buddhist Studies was established in Leningrad, but was closed during Stalin's Great Break in 1930. Most of the leading personnel of the Leningrad School of Buddhist Studies were killed in the Great Purge of 1937 to 1938. At the end of the 1920s, the central bureaucracy decisively seized control of the economy through forced collectivization and other measures, and marshalled all the resources to the cause of military competition with hostile imperial powers. Muslim national communists who worked with the Bolsheviks to defeat the White Armies during the Civil War and then to establish new Soviet republics with their own press, education system and administration were prominent victims of the Stalinist purges of the 1930s. The crushing of opposition currents and that accompanied this move dramatically affected Oriental studies, as centralization of the state also required the subordination of anti-colonial struggles to the foreign policy interests of the USSR. Perspectives that failed to support these policies were denounced, while those that supported them were officially promoted. Soviet specialists in the Oriental studies consequently became some of the most persecuted groups of intellectuals in the USSR. And this fact itself renders the idea of a continuity of perspective from 1917 to post-World War II era highly problematic. Some of the most sophisticated, talented and innovative thinkers in the field were fired, imprisoned or even killed, while their places were taken by opportunists and sycophants who sought to shape the field into a dogmatic sphere narrowly subservient to the requirements of the doctrines of the state. Statutory authority trumped scientific authority in all areas, including which positions could legitimately be regarded as Marxist. One favoured perspective was the linguistic theory of Nikolai Marr, which achieved official recognition as Marxist linguistics from 1932 through to 1950, despite the fact that his work had little in common with Marxism. I've shown elsewhere that while Marr had some important insights into the entanglement of European philology with imperialism, he denounced all linguistic and philological work based on the central paradigms as nothing but an ideology called Indo-Europeanism. This was somewhat akin to the Foucauldian discourse of power knowledge. An opposition to it he developed in his own counter-discourse called Japhetic theory, or the new theory of language. And here Marr advanced the controversial thesis that languages develop from plural origins to unity, rather than, as in Indo-European philology, the other way around, and deliberately echoed Stalin's pronouncement at the 16th Party Congress of the summer of 1930 that national cultures would, and indeed should, in the future, merge into a unity in both form and content under socialism. The peoples of the USSR were now allegedly converging because of the USSR's movement towards socialism in one country. Until there would be a final victory of socialism on a global scale, this convergence would remain limited to a unity of ideological content, coexisting with a flowering of various forms of national culture. The hybrid pan-Russian identity scholars like Barthold and Marr had been promoting before the revolution, now morphed into a pan-Soviet identity, with Russia as the big brother of a family of nations. The bipolar world that emerged from the beginning of the Cold War consolidated institutionally the dichotomy of competing discourses of power knowledge. While Marr had died as early as 1934, Marrism remained unchallenged until Stalin denounced it as a pseudoscience and non-Marxist in June 1950. But nevertheless, the main features of Indo-Europeanism, as developed by Marx's most doctrinaire followers, were inherited by a new discourse called bourgeoisное vostokovidение, bourgeois Orientalism. An ideological struggle between bourgeois and Soviet Orientalism began to appear in Soviet publications as the necessary corollary of the struggle for the allegiance of the decolonizing nations. The journal Voprosy Istorii, Questions of History, published a leading text in 1949 called The Urgent Tasks of Soviet Orientalist Historians. And here we see, and I quote, this is quite interesting, I think, these quotations. Bourgeois Oriental studies serve imperialism in an extraordinarily vigorous manner and serve to prove, in inverted commas, the historical inevitability and even the necessity, in inverted commas, of the rule of Western colonial powers over the multi-million masses who are lagging behind in their progress and are therefore incapable, in inverted commas, of independently deciding the fate of the East themselves. Such scholars produce false pseudo-historical theories and conceptions, which may differ in details on particular points, but they bear the testimony to the complete unity on the principle of the fundamental question. This involved the propagation of a particular type of exoticism about the special type of Eastern soul, relishing important details of the religious cults, or repeat entertaining palace anecdotes about dynastic histories. Soviet Orientalist historians were encouraged to facilitate, with the help of their own studies, the exposure of the false theories of the bourgeoisie. Now, this sentiment, somewhat softened in rhetoric, reappears in the 1951 edition of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, and the delineation of Soviet Orientalism distinct from the West gained importance, particularly as a result of the 1955 Bandung Conference, which eventually led in 1961 to the formation of the non-aligned movement. Perspectives on the tasks of Soviet as opposed to bourgeois Orientalism were further developed at the first All-Union Conference of Orientalists in Tashkent in 1957, at which continuities between the pre- and post-revolutionary Russian Orientalists were stressed, beginning with the publication of the complete works of Vasily Bartold. These perspectives were subsequently conveyed to many intellectuals from the various national liberation movements who were educated at such institutions as the Patrice Lumumba People's Friendship University in Moscow, founded in 1960, the same year that the USSR hosted the 25th International Congress of Orientalists. Here, senior Politburo member Anastas Mikoyan made a speech declaring that henceforth the peoples of the Orient themselves create their own history, their culture, their economy. In this way, the peoples of the Orient have been promoted from being objects or the matter of history to the rank of the creators. This speech and a number of Soviet sources, other Soviet sources, were quoted in the Egyptian Marxist's work, Egyptian Marxist Anwar Abdel Malik's work, Orientalism in Crisis in 1963, where the author also contrasted the persistence of what he called Europeocentrism in the West with a truly colossal effort in the field of modern Orientalism in the USSR since the Bandung Conference. Abdel Malik's article was one of the most important sources for Said's ideas about Orientalism. And it would be no exaggeration to say that Orientalism, which is almost entirely a critique of the tropes of British and French Oriental studies that have been inherited from mainstream inherited by mainstream US intellectuals, was to a considerable extent a recapitulation of bourgeois Orientalism. But this was obviously no more than a crude and highly selective summary, an opportunistically deployed formula derived from long and intense debates about the relationship between knowledge and the colonial world. This was sometimes tacitly acknowledged. But just to sum up then, the influence of the USSR, of course, over intellectuals in the decolonizing world depended on the resources at its disposal and its effectiveness in countering US imperialism, as well as the extent to which the Soviet model of state-led development actually worked. And all those factors declined sharply at the end of the 1970s. Just as the USSR's political influence waned, structuralist and post-structuralist thinkers who were alienated by the practice of the French Communist Party were seeking to justify their withdrawal from collective politics in the wake of the events of Paris in 1968. And they began treating Marxism as a unitary discourse of power knowledge. They also worked to give Said's eclectic work on idealism, on Orientalism, a more unified theoretical edifice, and in so doing, in some cases unwittingly, drew upon the Stalinist model of bourgeois Orientalism as a model for Orientalist discourse. Separated from its putative opponent, this discourse now included Marxism as a subset or even an exemplary instance. So the problem is that systematic consideration of the history of Marxist thought about non-Western societies was rendered irrelevant, and it's taken a number of decades for the question to return to the agenda. It is, however, an issue well worthy of considerable attention for two reasons, one of them scholarly, the other one political. Thank you.
Thank you. As the rule goes, we'll take a couple of questions, short ones, please. Yes, 1, 2. I'll take one more if there's a hand. 3, okay, all 3 in that line.
My name is Oritra Mujumdar, and I wanted to thank Craig, first of all, for a wonderful and stimulating presentation. So my question has to do with what you briefly talked about at the very outset at Post-Colonial Studies. And so it seems to me that in your talk, you outlined what would be like a Soviet prehistory or an intellectual history of what Post-Colonial Studies attempts to do much later. So my question is, how does one think about the trend in post-colonial studies, at least in the dominant paradigms, of referring back to those same, European thinkers of the 1930s and earlier, right? I'm thinking of, say, Dipesh Chakraborty's use of Heidegger, or Robert Young's recent efforts, which I was telling you about yesterday, of linking Fanon to Nietzsche. How do you respond to like these overtures that we see in recent times? Thank you.
Yes, is this better? Yeah. Hold it close, okay. I was wondering about the current status of the, like the hydraulic society analyses, basically. From there till today, I was curious about the, what
I'm sorry, there's a word I didn't hear there. Could you?
I'm interested in the hydraulic society.
Hydraulic?
Yes, which... yes, the massive water control-centered civilizations as a mode of production.
I had a question which appears to me as a contradiction in history, that on one hand, of course, there is this overarching critique of what happened under Stalin's rule, and your narrative kind of is part of that. But on the other hand, that same period from the 30s to the 60s is a period in which Stalin is immensely popular in erstwhile, like societies which are just like at the peak of the national liberation struggles, and in the first or 2 decades after independence, when Stalin died, there was huge mourning in India, for example, which went beyond the communists. So how do you reconcile this, that on one hand there is this, and on the other that there is this tremendous popularity?
Hello. Hi, Craig, thank you for this illuminating piece. I mean, it tantalizes me. Thank you. So, the question in the 1930s, and this is following on the
Please
theme
hold it
that,
closer. Huh? We can't hear you.
that Professor Dasgupta has already highlighted, that this is the time in India that not only the party Marxists or Stalinist Marxists, but also nationalist leaders, Nehru, even Rabindranath Tagore, they are traveling and they are talking to the Orientalists. And they are talking to the Orientalists not in Soviet only, also in China, Tagore for instance. And they are conversing, also in Japan. They are having a conversation and trying to idealize a non-West, be it India, in case of Rabindranath Tagore, it's larger Asia or greater Asia. It's a dream that gets hugely discredited with Japan's ascendancy to imperialism, but the dream is still there. And Soviet Orientalism, then what it does is that knowledge comes to, you have just mentioned the name of Sherbatskaya, the Soviet Orientalist philosopher, and Shankrita and Koshambi, and later on, M.N. Roy, and following M.N. Roy, Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay, much later in the 1950s, thinking about a materialism that has its roots in Indian philosophy, especially materialist Charvaka philosophy. So they are trying to devise a Charvaka materialism that can be the basis of a kind of historic materialism that is, fitting to writing about Indian historiography. This all things are going on, and this is not just a celebration of Russian foreign policy. It's a dream of the non-West that is motivating this anti-colonial movements. What are your take on that?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the way that contemporary post-colonial theorists often link these people from the past to the people like Nietzsche, well, I've always thought it extraordinary that the basis for the model, the genealogical model for post-colonial theory are two of the most reactionary and anti-democratic and Eurocentric philosophers that one could ever come across, i.e. Nietzsche and Heidegger. And the problem is that these people provided the basis for thinkers within universities to withdraw themselves from political activity, but at the same time to sound radical and innovative. And it seems to me that it meant a huge overgeneralization and a willful blindness towards a whole range of Marxist and related Marxian discourses in the interwar period in particular. And that's something that has recently been studied more, and I'm glad to see it is. Related to the Asiatic mode of production discussions, well, this was actually fundamental in the kind of what we might call the rectification of historical debates in the late 1920s. And then it gets kind of squeezed out of discussions from fairly early in the 1930s with the fall of prominent Soviet historians from the 1920s. So in the Soviet Union, largely this gets pushed into being a kind of blind alley that Marx stumbled into in the middle part of his career. As for how that's developed since then, I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I think we need to do some work on that. The popularity of Stalin in the decolonizing world in particular is an interesting one, of course, because the leaders of decolonizing world were particularly keen on extricating themselves from trade and other economic relationships that they had inherited from the colonial period. And in order to do that, they needed to look to the Soviet Union in particular as an alternative source of raw materials and basic industrial goods. And that only got stronger and stronger throughout the post-Stalin period as well. So Stalin then seemed as a model for an alternative anti-colonial form of development. Now that form of development, which I think is probably more accurately rendered as a form of state capitalist development, was extraordinarily successful. And of course it was the case that certainly from the beginning of the Great Depression, the general trend within all societies in the world was to move towards state control of the economy at one level or another. And of course the Soviet Union was a great model about how you can move from an extremely poor level of agricultural production to become a significant economic power with military might. And so of course it then became an important form of an important model for forms of development at that time. So, I mean, one of the ways that certainly if you read a lot of mainstream histories about this time, it tends to infantilize the policymakers in the East and the idea that they were somehow just seduced by the Soviet Union and so on. But actually they made a very deliberate choice to follow that particular path of development because it allowed them to extricate themselves from the old colonial relationships. And so they expected to be able to pursue their own agenda from it. And I'm not entirely sure what the last question was, actually. It was an interesting statement, and I agree that, yes, there are a lot of very interesting and important engagements between people like Debbie Proshad Chattopadhyay and working on the ideas of Sherbatskoy, for example. Those kinds of engagements are important and need to be studied, I think, and not to be reduced simply to those caricatures of Orientalism and so on that developed later and developed largely from the rhetorics of the Cold War and Stalin's own role in that.
Okay, thank you. I'll just leave you with a few uncomfortable questions that come to my mind. You know, it is exactly 100 years ago, I think, that the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires collapsed. And some say that if you look at what's happening from the Black Sea through former Yugoslavia right up to Yemen, they're still collapsing. Now, the question comes, how long will it take for the Soviet empire to collapse? Or will it be arrested somewhere down the road? I say this because from my old Soviet days contacts, I understand that the Central Asian republics, the 5 of them, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, the 5 Stanleys as they're called sometimes, that you have a very interesting disjuncture that you have the elites, the rulers, who are mostly old Soviet apparatchiks, you know, who are extremely pro-Chinese right now because China is coming in with massive investments and money. And then the general population, not just the ethnic Russians there, but the ethnic Uzbeks and Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and others, you know, they're extremely pro-Russian. It's a very interesting disjuncture that many people who work there under UNDP and others tell me. And it seems it's because for the people there, the Soviet and Russian, well, Soviet rule was what actually brought modernization to these places, with their universities, hospitals, schools, science, everything. And as a result, that is why the population feels tremendous affinity to Russia there. Now, this is the kind of uncomfortable question that, Craig, I think your talk and the discussion has incited. There are no easy answers, but we're going to go out of here with a lot of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Brandist and Dr. Gyawali. Can I request Dr. Sunita Lal to present the mementos?